Welcome back, everyone. I know y'all missed me, but this is Josh or Joushi Howard coming at you live once again with another episode of Officer Training School. And today, I decided I was going to be lazy and put all of the Leman Russ variants, except for the Exterminator, all in one big video because they're honestly all kind of the same. If you're wondering where I was, I had a business trip for about 2 weeks, and I am now back home, which means I can record more things. I also am working on an interview with someone who has done quite well with the Imperial Guard recently, and hopefully I'll get that out to you sometime next week while it's still relevant. Also, if you're interested in learning more about the competitive scene, I have this document still available up on my Ko-fi, which is apparently how you're supposed to pronounce it. As always, this will probably be the last time I mention it. It is free. If you want to support me, you are always more than welcome to. Just gotta click on the link down in the description so you can see all the goodness. Alright, today we're going to be talking about how to play Leman Russes. I technically go over all of the variants except for the Exterminator because I have an entire another video already on that. If you're interested in learning more about the Exterminator, go watch that video because it is the one Leman Russ that isn't basically the same as the rest of these. But after talking a little bit about Leman Russes in general, we talk about every single one of the variants, and then we'll talk a little bit out with the orders and the stratagems. We're going to go kind of fast on this one because there's so many different things, but realistically, after talking with a lot of other guard players who are better than me, they're like, yeah, they're kind of just stat blocks. So let's go ahead and talk about it. So, as I've said a couple of times, except for the Leman Russ Exterminator, Leman Russes are mostly just very efficient stat blocks in this edition. They do good damage because you get a ton of free, semi-free guns on the whole. You always do a lot of damage, kind of no matter what. You're really difficult to kill, especially now that there aren't nearly the same number of Eldar and Dark Lance and Bright Lances just everywhere. But the main difference between every single one of the Leman Russ holes is mostly what their main gun is. And you can kind of have small differences in what their preferred targets are. Other than that, Leman Russes, with the exception of the Leman Russ battle tank, tend to be pretty reliant on orders because we are guardsmen and we hit on 4s, but if someone yells at you really loudly and makes you hit on 3s, it's a 33% increase in firepower kind of for free. Lastly, Leman Russes will generally operate in one of two modes. They will either be a frontline Leman Russ or what I've called a fire support Leman Russ, and this mostly depends on how willing you are to get that Leman Russ into melee combat, and we will talk about this a fair amount. Now these are terms that are more like guidelines than they are hard things that you're going to want to do. But you can loosely define them by where they like to play on the board. Your frontline tanks are tanks that are primarily operating in no man's land. These will oftentimes be on objectives or very close to objectives in the middle of the board, and you should generally expect that 2, 3, sometimes 4 turns in a game, these Leman Russes will be in melee with something. Alternatively, fire support tanks tend to play further back on the board. These are mostly tanks where you care a lot more about how effective their shooting is every single turn, that you don't really want them to be in melee with things. Now, the difference in the stats that they have in terms of their actual defensive profile is the same. So that is not really the defining factor. Instead, the defining factor between whether or not it's a frontline or a fire support tank is how effective is the tank while it is in combat. A couple of things to think about here is how expensive is this version of the tank. The cheaper it is, the more willing you are to throw it away. The more expensive it is, the less likely you are to just throw it up into the middle of the board. There isn't really a hard line between this tank is always a frontline tank and this tank is always a fire support tank. And in fact, it's really flexible and understanding that while a tank is normally a frontline tank in a lot of your games, but it is not a frontline tank in this game, is the main thing you're going to have to learn as a guard player in order to actually find opportunities to improve. So let's talk a little bit about what frontline Russes are. Firstly, they tend to be cheaper. Like we said, if it's a cheap tank, you're more willing to lose it because you have more of your army left, right? If you lose one tank and it is a 200-point tank, that's 10% of your army. But if you have a tank that is 150 points, that's 7.5% of your army. That means you have 2.5% more of your army just left over if it dies. Another thing to think about is, can their main gun shoot into the combat that they're in? Or does the main gun care if it is in combat? We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go into each variant, but Demolishers and Eradicators both have blast weapons that you can shoot into combat, so they are more likely to be frontline, whereas a Leman Russ battle tank, which still also has a blast weapon, cannot shoot its main gun into its own combat. Therefore, you don't really want it to be in those positions where it cannot shoot at what it wants to shoot at. In general, your frontline Russes are your Demolishers, your Eradicators, your Punishers, and your Vanquishers. A major skill that you're going to have to learn about playing frontline Russes is understanding where on the board you actually want them to be in melee. On this board, you generally want to find spots that you can clog up the movement between these walls. If you currently have a Leman Russ in a spot where your opponent cannot move because they would have to walk through your vehicle, that's going to be a better spot than just having it somewhere in the open. You still want to try and get your Leman Russ to have cover some percentage of the time, even while it's in melee. But the biggest thing is making sure that you will still have sight lines and ideally cover while you are in all of these positions. Fire support Russes are probably how a lot of you are already playing Leman Russes in general. They tend to be more expensive, and I also tend to have better guns. However, later on in the game, fire support Russes also become frontline Russes simply because you have run out of things on the board and you need to have as many units as far forward as they can be. In general, you see all these little rectangles I have drawn so beautifully on the board. Each one of these rectangles is somewhere where it's typical to have a Leman Russ move between one side and the other, because on Games Workshop terrain, and also a lot of WGC terrain, most of these terrain footprints are somewhere between 10 and 12 inches long. And because the Leman Russ is about 4 inches wide, that means that it can move from one side of the terrain towards the other side and pick which side of this terrain it's going to be pulling line of sight from. And then with move, 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 with the 13 inches of movement, you are therefore able to pull a lot of line of sight in ways that you would not normally. In general, when you're moving around your fire support Russes, the things you need to be thinking about are, 1, am I shooting at a target that I want to? It's usually better to shoot at a better target than it is to shoot at something that happens to be close. 2, am I getting the benefit of cover while I'm standing in this spot? And 3, am I likely to get tagged in melee by standing in this position? If your opponent is going to force you to tag in melee, it's oftentimes worth it for your fire support Russes to become frontline Russes and just charge into the enemy so that you can decide where the engagement has happened and not give your opponents the freedom to dictate where the movement is happening. In general, your fire support Russes are the tank commander, the battle tank, demolishers, executioners, exterminators, which we won't talk about a whole lot more in this video, and vanquishers. Now, this slide is by far not exhaustive. However, this is an example of a thought process that I have used in previous games in order to try and determine whether or not I want my frontline Russes to be fire support or frontline. In general, you need to have a pretty good understanding of both what your list does and at least a basic understanding of what your opponent's list does. If you're trying to win by just winning on primary, and depending on the terrain layout, sometimes your frontline Russes can be fire support Russes because they will always be able to shoot anything that is on an objective. So as an example way to think about it, if you're playing up against a melee army that is like strictly melee, like let's talk about demons or world eaters or something, they are going to try and get into melee no matter what. So you need to figure out what kind of things you can put into melee with their stuff in order to prevent them from stopping your game plan from working. And you have to think about, can their melee kill my Leman Russ? The answer is yes. You probably don't want to use your frontline tanks even as melee there, because if you get a unit of Bloodthirsters with a character and the guy that makes some extra damage, you're going to lose that Leman Russ very quickly. So you need to make sure that it gets an extra turn of firing by using Bulgrin or Catachan or Chimeras to move block them, prevent them from actually getting in, even if it's normally a frontline Russ that you're trying to put it into. However, there are going to be other armies, sometimes like Nurglings or like Poxwalkers or something, where they're just going to try and drown you in useless garbage. In that case, charge your fire support Russes right on in, because if you are tagging a unit of 20 crew that can now no longer go stand in an objective because you have tagged them where they don't want to be, who cares that they're going to be melee attacking you every turn? They're going to be doing no damage. This is merely an example, so make sure you think about it every single time, and I would really recommend that you get as many of your games as possible in practice so that you can adjust this as you go. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about the first Leman Russ variant, the Tank Commander. The Tank Commander was one of the most popular units in the Guard Index prior to the June 2024 data slate. I'll probably be shorthanding this as the June 24 data slate going on out. Generally, you were seeing almost every competitive Guard list bring 2 or more of these in competitive games. However, it has changed a little bit on the most recent data slate, simply because, 1, the Tank Commander does not have the Squadron keyword. On top of not being able to receive orders from anyone other than Lord Solar himself, it means that the Tank Commander never benefits from the Newborn Soldiers, where it says that any of our Squadron vehicles that are shooting at vehicles or monsters get lethal hits. The Tank Commander doesn't have the Squadron keyword, so it doesn't get lethal hits against anything ever. However, the Tank Commander is still quite a good unit, and we're still seeing a lot of it being played in competitive lists, because it has one of the best abilities in the game. It is absolutely a fire support tank in 90% of your games. It's generally almost never a frontline tank, though it can serve that role. Now, when you're going to be playing your Tank Commanders, you're going to be always equipping your Tank Commanders with a Demolisher cannon. Games Workshop has pointed this at 205 points on the June 24 slate. This is assuming that you already have the Demolisher cannon. And unless for some reason you're playing on giant boards where you need a range that is larger than 24 inches, you don't need a range of longer than 24 inches. So you're just going to take the best gun, and the best gun is the Demolisher cannon, and it's not close. You're going to take a las cannon. You can choose to take multi-meltas or plasma. More people tend to be bringing multi-meltas just because most gameplay is less than 24 inches, and you don't usually need the extra range of the plasma, but you can go plasma. It's like reasonable. People do it. Also, take a heavy stubber and a hunter-killer missile. Let's talk a little bit about death befitting an officer, which is an incredibly strong rule. Basically, what it says is when you die on a 2+, you can shoot all of your weapons at any target you want. And orders are still active because orders last until our subsequent command phase after they were given. So, if your Tank Commander dies while it was under the order of Take Aim, it is shooting all of its weapons on a 3. However, you cannot activate this ability if you are in melee combat when you die, unless you somehow die in your own shooting phase, because Big Guns Never Tire does go off in your own shooting phase. Now, it's important to note that the WTC, UKTC, and FLG already were all ruling that this is how it worked before. However, if you need somewhere to actually point it out very clearly, if you go to the Warhammer community site and the downloads, look for version 1.5 of the index cards FAQ and errata, which very specifically says that this is how it works. Now, the way you need to be thinking about death befitting an officer is you should be assuming in your games that your Tank Commander is going to shoot an extra time on death if it is not in melee. There are going to be times where you are sad because you roll a 1. However, most of the time, more than 80% of the time, you're going to get an extra shoot on death. This means that if your Tank Commander moves out and it shoots at something, it's probably going to get to shoot at the target a second time. This is a huge threat to people, especially when you point out your Tank Commander and you say to them, hey, remember, if this dies, I get to shoot it. You can make your opponents make a lot of mistakes just by reminding them that you do shoot on death. It's important to understand that if you can get an extra activation on turns 2 or 3, so let's imagine that your Tank Commander shoots turn 1, shoots turn 2, and then dies in the bottom of turn 2, you suddenly get 3 activations. That's effectively having an extra turn of your Tank Commander every single game. And that is fantastic. Use your Tank Commanders in such a way such that you will almost always get that extra activation. Now, I'm going to complain for a little while because the Tank Commander in the WTC rules has some of the stupidest rulings I have ever seen. Okay? I hate this ruling. I think it's dumb. I've talked to a ton of people. They all agree it's dumb. However, if you play the WTC FAQ, you need to understand this rule. WTC has ruled that if the Tank Commander dies to something that is not an attack, it does not get to shoot on death. One exception to this being, if you die to your own hazardous check, you will still trigger death befitting an officer. What does this mean? This means that the grenade stratagem, Deadly Demise, so if a tank next to your Tank Commander dies and blows up, and the Tank Commander then dies, you don't get to roll a 2+. You don't get to try and shoot again. A lot of armies also have sources of mortal wounds that do not follow the attack sequence. An attack sequence needs to make a hit roll, a wound roll, and then you need to get a save roll if you would get a save roll. So other things that are not attacks are Doom Bolt from Thousand Suns. The Catan Nightbringers drain life. The Reductus Saboteurs plant explosives if you get too close. Our Kazakh Meltamine. Squighog Boys have a Bomb Squig. There are so many more examples of this throughout the game. If you die to something that is not an attack and you play WTC, you do not get to shoot again. Luckily for us, most of these things are short-ranged. As long as you're playing your tank commander as a fire support tank, not as a frontline tank, this doesn't come up very often. In fact, it doesn't come up hardly at all. However, it is really dumb, and you need to know about it. Did I mention how dumb I think this is? Now, in general, for tank commanders, you're going to want to bring somewhere between 0 and 2. It's pretty rare that people are bringing 3 of them these days, simply because they did get a fair nerf, not necessarily directly to them, but mostly nerfed by the fact that they didn't get lethal hits, whereas most of our other tanks did. On the first tank commander you bring, you probably want to bring the Grand Strategist enhancement on it. And this is usually because it pairs very well with all of our other vehicles. In a current meta, we're bringing a lot of Rogel Thorn battle tanks and Leman Russ battle tanks. Just giving out orders like this is going to be very effective. In general, the threat of your tank commander is almost as good, and sometimes stronger, than the execution. I typoed that, don't worry about it. What I mean by this is just, again, remind your opponents that you do get to shoot on death whenever it dies. And that will make them make mistakes. Now, this last part before we move on to other tanks is completely speculative. I have heard rumblings about this, but I have not had a whole lot of success with it myself. However, it is interesting, and I know other strong players are at least curious about trying it. So based on the recent changes to Vect abilities, including the Kurov's Aquila, where they now have an aura of 12 inches of all of your opponent's stratagems cost an extra CP, instead of the once per game make a battle attack that costs 1 more CP, a tank commander with Kurov's Aquila about 12 inches behind a frontline Leman Russ, or Chimeras, or Bulgarin, or anything in melee, can do a lot of work to stop your opponents from using free stratagems. Blood Angels, Lance, and Lethal is a very good example. Turning off Armor of Contempt can work very well. And it's one of the most durable things in the game that you can put this ability on. I'd recommend playing a couple games with this if you want to bring a second tank commander, since the first one probably has Grand Strategist. It is a 40-point investment, but it is at least interesting and could potentially win you some games if your opponent isn't expecting it. Alright, next, let's start talking about the Leman Russ Battle Tank, the classic workhorse of the Imperial Guard. Battle Tank is really nice because it's the most self-sufficient Leman Russ. It likes orders, but it doesn't need them. It's also some of the most efficient damage per point firepower in the entire Guard Index. I don't think that's a necessarily particularly useful statistic, but it is true. However, this is the Leman Russ variant that has the worst AP. At AP 1 on the main gun, you really enjoy having Exterminators or Hellhounds or access to Fields of Fire in your army to make the main gun even more effective. It's also the only Leman Russ that has decent Overwatch. The rest of them, like, you can do it, but it's usually more of a bait than it is worth the CP. The Leman Russ Battle Tank is also nice because you can play it as both a frontline tank, in the style that David Gaylord was pushing on previous patches, where you can use it as a rapid ingress threat, in which case it is very naturally just pretty far forward on the board. However, other players like Richard Kotzart have played it as a fire support tank, and you take 2, sometimes 3 of them, and it just does a lot of damage because you have so many rerolls, you have so many shots coming out of these things that they are very effective. The battle tank in general, you're always going to take the battle cannon, obviously, then you have a las cannon, and then plasma cannons are a little bit more popular than multi-meltas, but they're both good. Fire support tanks tend to prefer plasma just because you get a couple more shots on average, whereas frontline tanks tend to prefer multi-meltas because you can shoot them into your own melee, and also because you're more likely to be within range of the Melta 2. You're also going to take a Heavy Stubber and a Hunter Killer Missile. There's not a whole lot more to necessarily say about the Leman Russ Battle Tank, because it is mostly played as a fire support tank. And these are just going to be damage workhorses. You're just going to be doing a lot of damage with them. You're going to sit back, you're going to shoot at things, and you're going to try and make sure that you are trading up with your Leman Russes, which is hard to say more about without just being like, hey, just be good at 40k. However, the less obvious way to play the Leman Russ Battle Tank is the rapid ingress. And so basically the idea behind the battle tank as a rapid ingress threat is because it has full rerolls against targets on objectives, crucially that you do not control, the battle tank, even with its really bad AP but high strength, is a really credible threat against most backline units. So there are going to be map layouts, and this was particularly common on UKTC, where you really needed the extra movement that came with a rapid ingress. It was your only way to really get onto an objective or get close to an objective such that you could shoot at things if you weren't bringing enough indirect. What this would allow you to do is you would rapid ingress 9 inches away from your opponents, and then you would move 10 inches, which is farther than that. You would shoot at everything, and then you would charge and tank shock whatever was left. This would be really good for flipping objectives, especially on turn 3 in particular, where you can drop your rapid ingress into your opponent's deployment zone. This doesn't come up every game, and it usually requires your opponent to have something weak-ish, like cultists or guardsmen or whatever, to just be sitting around on an objective. However, whenever it does happen, it becomes an incredibly useful tool to just flip objectives of your opponent. Next, the Demolisher tank. This is slightly cheaper than a tank commander, which is its main draw in a lot of ways, and it does benefit from lethal hits. However, it received some indirect nerfs because of the way that people were mostly playing Demolishers in the first place, where you're playing them very aggressively. On the April 24 data slate, you were getting lethal hits when you remained stationary and shooting at all the infantry that was now tagging your Demolisher. However, losing lethal hits against those targets is a bit of an indirect nerf to the way that the Demolisher like to play. The Demolisher, however, is still an incredibly flexible beat stick. If you want a tank that does a lot of damage, the Demolisher is the tank you're looking for. If you don't want to care a whole lot about where the Demolisher is on the board, where your tanks are, the Demolisher is the perfect tank to be bringing for this. As always, you're going to be bringing a Demolisher cannon, a las cannon, and unlike some other variants, you don't really have an option here. This is almost always going to be multi-meltas. There are some people who will talk about bringing heavy flamers, and it's okay. But most of the time, I'd say like 95% of the time, you need to come up with a reason why you're not bringing multi-meltas. Also, a heavy stubber and a hunter-killer missile. The Demolisher has a really interesting rule called Line Breaker, and Line Breaker has an important set of terms and conditions that you need to fulfill. Firstly, the Demolisher cannon can shoot into your own combat, which is uncommon for blast weapons. And all of your weapons ignore the penalty to hit while you are in combat, which is great. However, this is the TNC. You cannot shoot your Demolisher cannon if you have multiple friendly units that are in the same combat. So if you have 2 tanks that are in melee with 1 enemy unit, the Demolisher cannon cannot shoot that unit. Also, plasma cannons can't shoot into that own combat. This is why you don't bring plasma cannons. In general, Demolishers are the tank that is the most flexible, but also potentially some of the highest skill expression in the entire guard index. Because you are constantly trying to go back and forth between, do I want to do the most damage I can, or should I give up a little bit of damage here in order to make sure that I can do more damage later? Maximizing the number of effective activations you can get from a Demolisher is the most important part of playing these tanks. Also, I forgot another spot here. The DZ just stands for Fire Support. I had to rebrand some of the things I was talking about because I was told they were confusing. But the Demolisher can play as both a frontline and a fire support tank depending on the needs of the list and the mission. However, if you are entirely planning to play fire support tanks, usually if you can spare the 5 points, you're going to want to bring the Demolisher as a tank commander instead. However, if you want something flexible, bring the Demolisher. Okay, the Eradicator. This tank kind of sucks. It's okay. It's not that this tank is bad, but rather our army is so good at killing Marines anyway that we don't really need it. The only real benefit to bringing an Eradicator is the fact that it has D3 plus 6 shots instead of D6 plus 3, which is nice. However, the main gun is just kind of useless. And there's only been one player who's brought an Eradicator this year, I think, and gone 4-1 or better. And it was David Purcell. And I talk to this guy all the time. He's like, yeah, that tank was kind of bad. The one thing I will say about the Eradicator is that it is a meta read. If you happen to be playing into a lot of Horde or pseudo-Horde armies, the Eradicator becomes okay. Simply because it is Strength 7, AP 2, Damage 2, which kills Marines really effectively. It's AP 1, but ignores cover, is functionally AP 2, fight me. So if you are playing in a Horde meta, then you can look at the Eradicator. However, most of the time, I would say, like, this isn't really a tank that's worth it. I'll talk about why when we get to Punishers and Vanquishers. Now, there is an interesting ruling that I have heard some TOs go for that I don't think is a valid reading of the rules, but maybe. So the important thing is that out-of-phase rules in general, so whenever it says as if it were, doesn't mean as if it were. It's really dumb. But it is how 40k has been accepted to be played in the competitive meta for a while. The Eradicator and the Demolisher both say when making ranged attacks with its main gun, you can target enemy units within engagement range of it. Notice this does not say in your shooting phase or as if it were your shooting phase. This means that some players will argue that you can overwatch after your tank has been charged, which is not something that you can do in general. The only time this is really useful is if you have infantry or something else that's breachable charge through a wall such that you could not overwatch them at the beginning of their charge, but once they tag you, you can now see them, so you can overwatch them now. This is really niche. This is really niche. And I'm not really convinced this is a valid reading of the rules, but I did want to bring it up because there are some TOs that will let you do it, and it is a nice little thing to have in your back pocket. Don't take your opponents by surprise with this. Make sure you ask your TO before it ever comes up in one of your games, such that you can tell your opponents whenever they're going to try and go for a charge that this would actually be useful. Do not use gachas. They do not make you good players. They just make you dicks. Okay, next, one of my favorite tanks, the Executioner. In theory, the Executioner is really good against Terminators and Marines. However, it did get nerfed against these targets because it no longer can ever get lethal hits against them. However, the lethal hits that it got recently on the June 24 slate does mean the main weakness of the weapon, and that it has low strength shooting at vehicles and monsters, is made up for a little bit by the lethal hits. Now, mathematically, I would recommend going to experiment with this for yourself. Use unitcrunch.com. Lethal hits is very close, mathematically, to being +1 to wound. It's not exact, but it's pretty close. And if you're just trying to do quick mental math to try and guesstimate like how much damage you're supposed to do, it's going to be close enough that you will rarely be able to tell the difference. So if you suddenly assume that the strength of the gun is actually equal to the toughness of most vehicles and monsters, it's nice. It's a nice buff. Even with this, the Executioner is still very meta-dependent due to the price of the tank. And it is still only a little bit better than the Leman Russ battle tank, even into its preferred targets, which are Marines and Terminators. It is better, but it still requires orders to be useful, and it doesn't really have a rule. Like, let's be real, the Executioner rule is one of the most irrelevant things in the index. Executioner is pretty straightforward. Executioner cannon, las cannon, plasma cannons, heavy stubber hunter killer. Nice, moving on. The Executioner is kind of similar to the Eradicator. It is going to shine in metas where there are lots of Terminators or Custodes and mid to light vehicles. Like, if you're playing into a lot of Drukari or some Tau lists, Executioner is going to be really good. However, I would very strongly recommend that you go to unitcrunch.com and compare the damage that this tank does to the Leman Russ battle tank into as many targets as you want, keeping in mind how likely you are to be re-rolling with the Leman Russ battle tank, and see if this is actually a tank that you want to bring. If your local meta is bringing a lot of Marines, a lot of toughness 7 and toughness 8 vehicles, bring the Executioner. However, I will posit that if that is true, you can probably beat them with Leman Russ battle tanks anyway, because your opponents are bringing bad lists. Okay, the Punisher, the Leman Russ Punisher, one of the cooler tanks in the index. I had not seen a Punisher brought to a single winning guard list until like a week ago, when Rich, the 95th Oliver, brought 3 Punishers to Dumfries Charity GT, and he went 4-1 there. The Punisher is fairly unique in that it has the highest damage output against guard equivalent units, so guardsmen, crew, cultists, etc., and does actually pretty decent damage into marines and terminators because it has dev wounds and other similar things. However, I will say something similar about the Punisher that I said about the Eradicator. If you are having trouble clearing out hordes, it's probably because your list is bad. So if you need to bring a Punisher to make up for the fact that you are struggling to clear out hordes, you probably should reworking your list. Unless your meta just has so many hordes that you just need to counter the skew over and over again, the Punisher is just kind of an okay tank. It is particularly good, like I said, against guard equivalents, and it got a little bit better against vehicles now that has lethal hits, but your main gun is just so weak that, like, meh. Alright, the way you equip your Punisher is the same as all the other ones. You take Punisher Cannon, Las Cannon, Multi-Meltas, and Heavy Stubber and Hunter Killer. Now, I have seen some people on Reddit saying that you should be bringing Flamers and Heavy Bolters on this tank. That's just bad. Heavy Bolters have 3 shots. Multi-Meltas have 2 shots. At best, a Heavy Bolter will do 8 damage to a target if everything goes through when you functionally have AP 0. Bring the good gun because multi-meltas are so much more effective. Like, legitimately, I don't know if you guys were playing in 9th edition when bringing multi-meltas costs like 20 points. The heavy bolters cost you like 5 points. Like, they're just that much better. Don't bring the bad guns. You're paying for the good guns. Take the good guns, you guys. Come on. This isn't hard. Okay, lastly, let's talk about the Vanquisher. I've been seeing more and more people on Reddit talk about the Vanquisher. And the Vanquisher is a really good tank now. It took me a while to come around to this idea, and one of the major things I will say about why my opinion changed is because I had a major mental block about the idea of using Leman Russes as melee units. And once you can get over that hurdle and think to yourself, wait, what if the Leman Russ isn't meant to just shoot things? What if it's meant to not die? Then suddenly, the Vanquisher becomes really cool because it's so cheap. Now, with this in mind, the Vanquisher spam was first pioneered by David Purcell at Warzone Dice Goblin, where he brought 3 of them. And since has seen play by Noah Pope, Manuel, and Martin Cooper. And unintuitively, for many people, the Vanquisher is actually a good frontline tank. The main reasons for this are, firstly, it's cheap. At 145 points on the June 24 slate, it is the cheapest Leman Russ that we can bring. And at toughness 11, 2-up save, it is really durable to a lot of potential threats. Now, the way you're going to be equipping your Vanquisher is pretty straightforward. You take the Vanquisher, you take a Las Cannon. If you're going to be playing your Vanquisher primarily as a frontline, you're always going to go multi-meltas. However, you can also play them for fire support tanks. So the Vanquishers are fairly flexible in the way that you actually want to bring them. So you can bring Plasma there as well. You're also going to be bringing a Heavy Stubber and a Hunter Killer. Now, one of the main reasons why you bring a Vanquisher over something like a Demolisher is that it is about 50 points cheaper. And that means that if you were to bring 3 Vanquishers, you would have enough points to bring a 4th Vanquisher. The other main thing that you're going to be doing is when you have a Vanquisher cannon, and you put it in a long firing lane, which do exist on some terrain layouts, one of them, when we plan, we should assume that the Vanquisher cannon always misses. Like the first one, like one of them will just always miss. Just assume it does. But your opponent needs to plan around the fact that it'll always hit. So for us, we want to be bringing multiple Vanquisher cannons such that we can bypass how inconsistent the main gun is. Suddenly, if you're only shooting one of them, you just assume it misses. But if you're shooting a second and a third Vanquisher cannon downrange, suddenly everything in the game has to respect that firepower. So what you tend to do with your Vanquishers is you tend to use them kind of in a group, and you will push them all together out in the middle. You're going to overload one firing lane such that they can all shoot down the same thing and really prevent your opponent from putting anything in that firing lane. And then everything else on your tank, including your multi-meltas, the stubber, and the las cannon, can either shoot downrange or they can shoot into your own combat. This strategy actually got better on the most recent June 24 slate because of the major change to tank shock. We'll talk about that in just a minute. One of the main reasons why I would recommend that you bring Vanquishers over Punishers and Eradicators is the Eradicator and the Punisher will do a little bit more damage to Marines and Guardsmen and Crute and other similar things. However, they do almost no damage to other vehicles. You cannot win tank duels with Punishers and Eradicators. However, with a Vanquisher you can. And the difference between having one gun in a firing lane versus having no guns in a firing lane is huge. One of the major examples I always give is the idea of the all infantry Custodes list throughout most of Leviathan, where the Custodes could either bring all infantry with like Warden bricks, or they could bring a couple of Warden bricks and then 2 Caladius grav tanks. And the Caladius grav tanks had like super twin-link glass cannons or something. And if your opponent didn't bring those Caladius grav tanks, you could just completely disrespect their shooting across the entire board. And a similar thing is true if you're bringing Eradicators and Punishers. If I'm playing against you and you have Eradicators and Punishers, I'm going to disrespect your shooting. But if you have a Vanquisher, I have to respect your shooting simply because my Leman Russes can die to your Vanquishers. And so that's a major reason why we generally see Vanquishers unless you're trying to go for some specific meta read, because your opponents are bringing a lot of Hordes and or Marines. Alright, we can go ahead and breeze through the orders and stratagem section. We always do this, but your orders for tanks are very straightforward. Firstly, you have a pretty simple flowchart in order to figure it out. If you can shoot at something without needing bonus movement, give it take aim. If you need a little bit more movement in order to shoot, or you could not shoot even with extra movement, give it move, move, move. This allows you to reposition. The other major thing I'll say about move, move, move is your opponents need to respect the fact that your tanks can move 13 inches whenever you need them to. So what I would generally recommend is your opponents will make mistakes and play more cautiously if you are very upfront and continuously tell them, hey, my tanks can move 13 inches if I need them to. Just tell them that over and over again. You will find that your opponents will over-respect your ability to move. The last thing I'll say before moving on is that there will be times where making your tanks OC4 instead of OC3 is really nice. You could deny victory points from your opponents by being OC4. Give your tanks duty and honor. It's okay to do a little bit less damage if you're preventing your opponents from scoring. Stratagems, there's not a whole lot of really good ones, but there are a couple that we really need to focus on. Firstly, Fields of Fire. You will usually not want to spend 2 CP to use it on a tank, when you can instead spend 1 CP to use it on a Mortar near Creed and point and click at whatever you want and say, hey, that has bonus AP against it for the rest of the turn, or for the rest of the phase, rather. But it is important to note that Fields of Fire says that anything that has the regiment or squadron keywords gets a bonus AP against it. The tank commander does not get this, because it does not have the squadron keyword. The stratagem that you're going to be using on your tanks the most is Tank Shock. Now, because of the recent change to Tank Shock, where it is no longer based on the strength of your weapon, rather the toughness of your tank, all of our Leman Russes are toughness 11. And this means we're going to average slightly less than 4 mortal wounds every single time. This is a pretty decent number. When Grenades was already one of the best stratagems that we could use every single turn, and it was averaging 3 mortal wounds of things, averaging 4 mortal wounds is really good to hit high-value targets or to finish off something that's low HP, because remember, the difference between something being dead and having 1 wound is a huge difference. Now, with the exception of the Leman Russ Battle Tank, there's a lot of baits. Smokescreen is a really overrated stratagem. If you're going to be using Smokescreen, it should mostly be because you're getting benefit of cover, rather than because you're making yourself -1 to hit. Most of the things that can shoot at a Leman Russ and kill it can usually kill it, even if you Smokescreen. There are going to be times where you just want to make your opponent shoot an extra thing at the Leman Russ, in which case Smokescreen can be okay, but it's usually not worth the CP. I'd recommend doing a lot of math before you actually start using it. Armored Might is also a pretty big bait. For 2 CP, just being -1 damage, like, we're already so durable that it only really comes up if you're shooting, or if you're getting shot by damage 3 or damage 2 weapons. To start wrapping this up, let's go ahead, Alright, to start wrapping this up, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about comparing Leman Russes to Rogaldorns. The June 24 slate reduced Rogaldorn's points to 240, and the Rogaldorn is very cheap and very good for what it does. It's also a very effective way to concentrate orders. You don't need to bring as many orders if you don't have as many units. However, Leman Russes, point for point, generally do more damage than a Rogaldorn. So you're generally paying for having a very durable shooting platform. The other major reason why you would take more Leman Russes over Rogaldorns is just to have more things on the board. I'm a big fan of having things on the board, and the more things you have, the more things you can do. But it is something that you do have to think about as you are going for your list building. Next, Leman Russes are mostly just trading pieces. Because Leman Russes are low OC, and we have the cheapest battle line in the game, you mostly just bring Leman Russes to kill things. You use them to kill things that are scoring for your opponent. You use them to kill the things that are preventing you from scoring. And because you have lethal hits against vehicles and monsters, we have some of the most effective anti-tank shooting in the entire game. Don't get baited into only using your tanks to shoot at their tanks. If their tanks are not preventing us from scoring, we don't really care about them as much. Shoot the things that are threats to our cheap battle line. Last thing I'll say is main guns of the tanks are nice, but the rest of the tank is nicer. For the base cost of about 140 points, you get 2 multi-meltas, a las cannon, a hunter killer missile, and a heavy stubber. And then it's all about what other goodies you want to be tacking onto that tank. If you want some really good shooting, you can pay more for the tank commander or demolisher. If you want self-sufficient tanks that don't really need a ton of help, go ahead and get yourself some battle tanks. But if you just want these really awesome toughness 11, 2+ save, 13 wound holes, you can go ahead and get the cheapest tanks, which are Vanquishers. And then by using them to control a lot of the board space, you take up a lot of real estate in the middle of the board to really limit what your opponents can do. I remember I did a poll a while back on whether or not you guys wanted to see like one mega video or like each variant getting its own thing, and this is kind of my compromise, right? I ended up doing one on the Exterminator and one on the rest of them because the Exterminator is kind of the only one that is really unique. The rest of them kind of just do the same thing, more or less. So this one will end up being a little bit longer than the rest of them, I imagine, after I'm done editing. But before I let you all go, I wanted to say thank you to the people who have contributed significantly to these as usual. David Purcell from the US, Matthew Searle from Oceania, Paul Clifton from China, Nick Jagiello from Canada, and Mike Askey from the UK. Thank you to all of you guys for your continued contributions to this channel. If you're interested in supporting my channel, of course, there will be a Ko-fi link down in the description as well. We're getting closer and closer to actually being able to add memberships to the channel. So if you guys are interested in potentially setting up a Discord to come hang out and talk to me and other cool people, let me know and I can go ahead and get that thing set up. Otherwise, I hope that this latest episode of Officer Training School has been helpful to you guys. I have a couple of GTs on the horizon, so I will be making after-action reports for those. They include Palm Springs Open and Hammer of Wrath. So look forward to seeing how I continue to adapt to Pariah Nexus. I also, like I said, I'm hoping to get some interviews up with people who have done well at GTs in the near future to hopefully help share more perspectives on the game than just mine. But with all that said, once again, this has been Joshua Joshi Howard. You've been watching Officer Training School, and we'll see you guys all next time. Bye-bye.